Millionaire boss takes a wrong turn into women's bathroom and instantly regrets it. That was the headline people whispered about in the halls of Ryland Tower, but none of them knew the real start of it. It began on a cold Chicago morning when a rushed CEO pushed open the wrong door, and a janitor with $6.25 in her pocket looked up, startled. The silence that followed wasn't simple embarrassment. It carried accusation, authority, and the weight of a mistake that would soon be pinned on the wrong person. And before she could explain what actually happened, the footsteps of power were already closing in. Elena Ward had grown used to being overlooked. At 32, she moved through the polished corridors of Ryland Tower, the same way she moved through most places in life, quietly, efficiently, and without drawing attention. She worked the early shifts as part of the janitorial crew, a job she never bragged about, but never apologized for either. It kept the bills paid, kept her teenage niece fed, and kept a tiny corner of stability from collapsing under them. She'd grown up on Chicago's South Side, raised by a mother who never had much, but passed down one unwavering belief: hold your ground, even when no one sees you. Elena repeated it silently, whenever supervisors barked orders, whenever customers ignored her presence, whenever another unexpected expense showed up in the mailbox. That simple line was the thread that kept her stitched together on the hardest days. Her life was a constant calculation: bus fare, grocery discounts, the cheapest laundry cycles. She allowed herself exactly $6.25 a day for lunch, a number she protected almost like a ritual. It was proof she was still in control of something, even when most of her world felt driven by other people's rules. She never imagined her path would cross directly with Mark Ryland, the building's CEO, whose name was printed on every door plaque and investor report. Elena knew him only from the glossy photos in the lobby and the occasional sight of him surrounded by assistants. He belonged to a world of private elevators, catered lunches, and mineral water that cost more than her entire daily budget. She didn't envy him. She didn't resent him. She simply assumed their lives would run parallel, never touching. But that morning in the women's restroom would shatter that distance in ways she couldn't have predicted. For weeks, Elena had been holding on to one small, fragile hope: a promotion. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't the kind of opportunity anyone in the upper floors would think twice about. But for her, it meant everything. Facility supervisor, a title barely noticed by most, yet it came with steadier hours, a modest raise, and health insurance good enough to help her niece get the therapy sessions she'd been missing. Her manager had hinted that the position was hers if inspection day goes smoothly. That meant spotless floors, stocked supplies, zero complaints, and above all, no incidents. Elena prepared like someone packing for a rescue mission. Extra gloves, backup cleaning cloths, emergency supplies hidden on every floor. She needed that job, not for pride, but for survival. If she failed, the promotion would go to someone with far fewer responsibilities and far more connections. Loss of hours was possible too. Management was quick to cut shifts when they found excuses. Elena had been through enough unstable months to know what that would mean. Overdue bills, skipped meals, the risk of losing their apartment. She couldn't let that happen. One perfect day was all she needed. One perfect day, until the wrong door opened. Inspection morning had barely begun when Elena slipped into the women's restroom on the executive floor to finish her routine. She moved quickly, wiping down sinks, restocking paper towels, checking stalls. This was the last space on her list before the inspectors arrived. One more room done. One step closer to the promotion. Then the door swung open with a sharp, echoing push. A tall man in an expensive suit walked in, eyes fixed on his phone, stride impatient. At first, Elena assumed it was another distracted executive assistant who'd mistaken the sign. But when he looked up, startled, confused, then irritated, she recognized him instantly. Mark Ryland, the CEO. The name on the building. He froze. She froze. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. "This is," Elena began, trying to steady her voice. But before she could finish, he stepped back with visible discomfort, as if he had walked into something compromising. "Why are you in here while it's open?" he asked, tone clipped. It wasn't loud, but it cut cleanly across the space. "It's closed for cleaning, sir," Elena replied, raising the yellow sign between them. He exhaled sharply. Whether embarrassed or annoyed, she couldn't tell, and rushed out without another word. She thought that was the end of it. A simple mistake. Awkward, but harmless. It wasn't. Minutes later, as she left the restroom, she found Mr. Keller, head of operations, waiting with two supervisors. Their expressions were tight, disapproving, rehearsed. "We've received a complaint," Keller said. An employee was alone in an active restroom while an executive entered. Elena, one supervisor, added, "This is unacceptable on inspection day." She tried to explain. She held up the caution sign. She repeated the policy she followed every day. But Keller's eyes were already narrowed. His mind made up. The CEO was put in an inappropriate situation. "This reflects poorly on our department." Her stomach dropped. People in nearby cubicles looked up. Someone whispered. Someone else shook their head. "This could cost us the entire inspection," Keller continued. "We can't afford negligence." Negligence. The word hit harder than the accusation itself. Elena felt the blood drain from her face. A mistake she didn't make, one caused by someone above her rank, was now being hung around her neck like a warning sign. The promotion, the raise, the health insurance, the stability, everything felt suddenly fragile, like dust in her hands. And she could see from their expressions that none of them were interested in hearing her truth. Mark Ryland hadn't meant to linger. He should have been in the boardroom, preparing for the quarterly briefing. But something in that brief, awkward encounter unsettled him. He didn't often walk the executive floor hallways alone. Usually, someone paved the path before him. But today, he wandered a few steps past the restroom, mind replaying the moment. It had been his mistake, his wrong turn, his embarrassment. Yet he'd spoken sharply, reflexively, in that clipped tone executives used when they didn't want to admit fault. And the look on the janitor's face, Elena, he remembered her badge, stayed with him longer than it should have. He turned back, just far enough to hear raised voices behind the frosted glass partition that led to the restroom corridor. Keller's voice carried first, stern and displeased. "If the CEO is inconvenienced, it reflects on us." Then a quieter voice, Elena's, trying to explain, trying but failing because she was being talked over. Mark moved closer, stopping at the edge of the open workspace. From where he stood, he had a clear view through the glass walls of the meeting nook. Elena stood stiffly in her uniform, gloves still in her pocket, supervisors flanking her like guards. Her eyes weren't angry. They were steady, strained, resigned. He recognized that expression. It was the look of someone used to being blamed for problems created above her. He felt an unwelcome sting in his chest. Mark wasn't naive about class lines. He'd benefited from them his whole life. He was raised in Winnetka, heir to a father who'd built the company from a regional supplier into a national power. Mark had stepped into the CEO role not through struggle, but inheritance. And though he worked hard, he knew the ground beneath him was softer, cushioned, forgiving. But watching Keller lean toward Elena with that familiar corporate condescension, Mark felt a rare, uneasy awareness. His mistake had consequences for her in ways it never would for him. She jeopardized inspection protocol, Keller declared. Mark's jaw tightened. He knew that wasn't true. Another supervisor whispered, "She should have been more careful. The CEO shouldn't walk into that." Mark felt the absurdity of it. He had been careless, not her. For the first time in a long time, he hesitated. Not as a CEO, not as a figurehead, but as a man who knew he had caused harm, simply by existing higher on the ladder. He should walk into that meeting room, correct the lie, clear her name. But the board was expecting him. His schedule was rigid, and speaking up would mean confronting his own leadership team. So he stood there in silence, watching an injustice unfold behind glass, knowing exactly who was responsible for it. And knowing the moment he kept quiet, things would only get worse. By noon, the executive cafeteria hummed with low conversations and clinking dishes. Another polished space where status was on open display. Suits lined up for catered lunches. Assistants hovered. Workers in uniform stayed on the outskirts, moving quickly so as not to interrupt the flow of important people. Elena entered only because she had to. She was assigned to refresh the sanitation stations. Still shaken from the morning, she kept her head down, repeating her mother's creed silently. Hold your ground, even when no one sees you. But people were seeing her now. Whispers followed her like a shadow. That's her. Inspections ruined. Keller's furious. Elena tightened her grip on the sanitizer bottles. She just needed to finish her task and get out. Across the room, Mark Ryland was trying to ignore the murmurs too. He had hoped the situation would fade quietly, but it hadn't. His silence had allowed the narrative to grow teeth, and now every word he overheard carried the same false story. The janitor embarrassed him. She broke protocol. She caused trouble. He watched Elena stand alone near the coffee station, back straight but shoulders tense, and something in him snapped. A simple truth cut through the noise. He was the only one who could stop this. He rose from his table. Conversations dipped. People noticed immediately. CEOs didn't casually roam. Mark walked toward Elena with a stride that wasn't confident, but purposeful. When he reached her, she looked up slowly, wary. "Ms. Ward," he said, loud enough for those around them to hear, "may I speak with you a moment?" A supervisor nearby stiffened. Two assistants exchanged quick looks. Elena blinked, confused. "Sir?" Mark took a breath and projected his voice. Not angry, not dramatic, just firm. "I want to make something clear. The incident this morning was my mistake. I entered the wrong restroom. You followed protocol exactly as you should have." A ripple moved through the cafeteria. Forks paused mid-air. Keller, who had just stepped inside, froze. Elena stared at Mark, searching his expression for insincerity, but found none. He continued, turning slightly so everyone could hear. "I don't want any disciplinary action taken against you, and I expect the record corrected." Keller stepped forward, cheeks tightening. "Sir, with respect, the issue was her timing. Underline." "No," Mark cut in calmly. "The issue was my timing." The room fell silent. It was the first time many employees had ever seen anyone at that level take blame publicly. For Elena, the shock wasn't the words themselves. It was the fact that he had spoken them here, in front of everyone, shattering the narrative that had been strangling her since morning. And in that unexpected moment of truth, the balance between them shifted, uneasily, irrevocably. The cafeteria moment didn't end the fallout, it only redirected it. By late afternoon, Elena was summoned to the operations office. The request came through a terse message from Mr. Keller himself. When she entered, the door clicked shut behind her with the kind of finality that made her pulse quicken. Keller sat at his desk, fingers steepled, expression unreadable. He didn't offer her a seat. "You put me in a difficult position today," he said quietly. Elena frowned. "Sir, the CEO corrected what happened. That's not the point." His voice sharpened. "Chain of command exists for a reason. If there's a misunderstanding, you bring it to me. Not allow an executive to be blindsided in public." She stared at him, stunned. "Allow?" The word caught in her throat. "Sir, I didn't ask him to say anything." Keller stood, smoothing his tie. "Employees like you need to remember your place." He paused, letting the weight of those words settle between them. "This department runs on order, compliance, not scenes in front of staff." Elena felt the ground stir beneath her feet. Anger, disbelief, exhaustion, all pressing against her ribs. But she remembered her mother's creed: hold your ground, even when no one sees you. "Mr. Keller," she said, voice steady, "I didn't make a scene. I was correcting sanitizer levels. He approached me." Keller's eyes narrowed, as if her calmness itself offended him. "If this happens again, any incident, any disruption, you can forget that promotion. And you may find your hours significantly reduced." There it was, not a threat, a promise. She swallowed hard. "Sir, I've done my job every day with respect. I won't apologize for something that wasn't my fault." His jaw clicked. "Think carefully about how you want your future here to look." Elena walked out with her hands trembling, but her spine unbent. For the first time, she realized the fight wasn't just about the restroom incident. It was about whether she was allowed to stand up at all. The hallway outside the operations office felt narrower than usual, the fluorescent lights harsher. Elena walked quickly, not wanting anyone to see the tightness in her jaw or the sting gathering behind her eyes. She needed air, space, silence. But when she rounded the corner toward the service stairwell, she nearly collided with Mark Ryland. He must have been waiting for her. "Elena," he said softly, "are you okay?" She stiffened. "Why are you here?" His expression tightened with concern. "I heard Keller called you in. I wanted to make sure that I'm grateful," she snapped before she could stop herself. Mark blinked. "That's not what You barged into the women's restroom. I did my job. Then I'm the one dragged into meetings, whispered about, blamed. And now everyone thinks I'm the janitor the CEO had to rescue. Do you know how that looks?" Her voice cracked, not from weakness, but from pressure strung too tight. Mark stepped back, startled by her intensity, but trying to stay steady. "I wasn't rescuing you. I was correcting a lie." "Maybe," she said, "but now everyone assumes I needed you to step in, like I couldn't defend myself." "That's not fair," he said quietly. "Neither is today," she shot back. The silence between them thickened. Mark exhaled, the guilt settling deeper into his shoulders. "I didn't mean to make things worse. I thought speaking up publicly would help." "It did," she admitted, voice lowering. "But it also made me look small, like I'm someone who waits around for rich men to fix things." His jaw flexed. "You think I see myself like that, as some kind of savior?" "I think," she said, choosing each word carefully, "you don't understand how easily people like me get labeled, how hard I work not to owe anyone anything." Her $6.25 lunch budget, the careful independence she guarded. He didn't know those things. He didn't see the daily balancing act she lived with. Mark swallowed. "I wasn't offering charity. I was taking responsibility." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw sincerity, but also the heavy weight of a man unused to being confronted by his own privilege. "Responsibility is quiet," she murmured, "not loud in a cafeteria." A faint shame flickered across his face. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words landed without theatrics, simple and real. Elena nodded, but the tension didn't dissolve. Their worlds were too different, their wounds too fresh. For the first time since the incident began, they stood facing each other not as CEO and janitor, not as offender and victim, But as two people forced into a conflict neither had fully chosen, and neither yet knew, this was only the beginning. By the next morning, the situation took an unexpected turn. A company-wide directive landed in everyone's inbox. A new initiative on workplace safety and inclusivity, mandated by the board and overseen jointly by the CEO and operations. It was Keller's attempt to redirect attention after yesterday's embarrassment, but the pairing he assigned was no accident. Lead coordinator, Mark Ryland; employee liaison, Elena Ward. Elena stared at the email in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered. In a different corner of the building, Mark had the same reaction, but for opposite reasons. He knew Keller was behind it, hoping to keep Elena close and under scrutiny, while placing pressure squarely on Mark to smooth things over. Their first meeting took place in an empty conference room, sterile, overlit, draped with glossy posters about employee wellness. Elena sat as far from the head of the table as physically possible. Mark sat halfway down, choosing not to take the symbolic seat of power. "We don't have to like this," Mark began, "but we need to get through it." Elena exhaled. "I do my part. That's all I'm responsible for." He nodded. Fair enough. They reviewed checklists, drafted schedules, and discussed walkthroughs of public areas, hallways, break rooms, entry lobbies, places where status was visible in every small detail. Elena spoke clearly about the gaps she saw daily: unsafe equipment, ignored maintenance requests, workers rushing because they feared reprimands. Mark listened, really listened, for the first time. At one point, he paused and said, "Why hasn't any of this reached me?" Elena didn't soften her answer. "Because no one expects you to care." The words weren't meant to wound, they were simply true. And for the first time since the restroom incident, something shifted. Not warmth, not friendship, but recognition. They weren't allies yet, but they were no longer strangers, standing on opposite sides of a locked door. Their partnership forced them into corners of the building neither usually visited. For Mark, it meant stepping into supply closets and service corridors that smelled faintly of bleach and exhaustion. For Elena, it meant stepping into boardrooms where the air was too cold and the chairs too soft. Spaces designed for people who never worried about rent or late fees. One evening, long after most employees had gone home, they found themselves working on the top floor, an empty expanse of glass and quiet. The city lights glowed beneath them like a second sky. Elena stood by the whiteboard, going over the survey they had drafted. "If workers report issues anonymously," she said, "you'll finally see what they're afraid to say out loud." Mark leaned against the table, looking unusually tired. "I don't know if they'll be honest with me." "They won't," she replied plainly, "but they'll be honest with each other." He didn't argue. He just nodded, as though accepting a truth he'd avoided for years. A moment of silence stretched between them, not tense, just open. Elena reached into her bag, pulling out a crumpled receipt for her niece's medication refill. She didn't mean to show it, but it slipped from her fingers onto the table. Mark picked it up instinctively before she could snatch it away. He scanned the total. Her daily pay barely covered it. "I shouldn't have seen that," he said, handing it back gently. "It's fine," she replied, though the tightness in her voice said otherwise. "It's just life." Mark hesitated, then confessed something he rarely admitted aloud. "The board doesn't think I'm strong enough to run the company. They see me as someone who inherited power, not someone who earned it. I'm always one mistake away from being replaced." Elena looked at him, surprised. "You're the CEO." "And still trapped," he said quietly. Different cage, same lock. The honesty disarmed her. She sank into a chair across from him, the weight of the day finally settling. I thought people like you didn't worry about anything." He gave a faint, sad smile. "I thought people like you never struggled with pride." They both laughed once, soft, tired, real. In that quiet room above Chicago, with the city humming beneath them, they realized something neither had considered before. They were not living the same life, but they were living the same fear, being unseen, unheard, and replaceable. It didn't make them equal, but it finally made them human to each other. The public reckoning came during the weekly all-hands meeting, an event where every department gathered in the main atrium, a place of glass railings, polished floors, and a podium meant for people far above Elena's pay grade. She stood off to the side with the other staff, unnoticed as usual. Mark stepped up to the microphone, prepared remarks in hand. But halfway through his speech about workplace improvements, he set the papers aside. "There's something more important," he said, his voice carrying across the room. Heads lifted. Keller stiffened in the front row. Mark continued, calm but unshakably clear. "Our new safety and inclusivity initiative began because of a mistake I made. I entered the wrong restroom. An employee, Miss Elena Ward, followed protocol exactly, yet she faced blame, not me." A stunned hush spread through the atrium. Elena froze. "This company cannot operate on fear or forced silence," Mark said. "If anyone deserves recognition today, it's her." Every eye shifted toward Elena. Not with pity, this time with respect. Keller's jaw tightened, unable to conceal the humiliation now landing squarely on him. For the first time, the hierarchy cracked, and Elena, who had spent her life being unseen, was finally visible. Later that week, Elena found herself back in the women's restroom on the executive floor, the same place where everything had begun. But the air felt different now. No whispers, no accusation waiting behind the door, just quiet. She replaced a soap cartridge, her motions steady, unhurried. On the counter sat a small envelope with her name written neatly. She hesitated before opening it. Inside was a simple notice: promotion approved, facility supervisor. Below it, in smaller print, was a handwritten note from Mark. "You held your ground. You were right to." Elena exhaled, slow, full, almost shaky. Not triumph, not relief, something gentler. She looked at the yellow caution sign beside her, the same one she had held between herself and a startled CEO days earlier. But now, it wasn't a shield. It was simply part of her job, a job she had earned, not begged for, not been saved into. As she placed the sign back where it belonged, she whispered her mother's creed under her breath. "Hold your ground, even when no one sees you." This time, she said it knowing someone finally had. And somewhere down the hall, without fanfare or attention, Mark Ryland paused mid-step, quietly grateful for the lesson she had never meant to teach. Some stories begin with a mistake, but the ones worth remembering end with growth. Elena didn't rise because someone powerful lifted her. She rose because she stood firm when the world tilted against her. And in doing so, she changed more than her own path. She changed the way someone at the top finally learned to see. If this story made you pause, feel, or think about the quiet strength around us every day, consider staying with us for more. If this story made you feel something, like, comment, and subscribe.